Tibet is cracking under the weight of China's grand ambitions, and COP30 could no longer look the other way. The world's highest plateau, the third pole, cradle of Asia's rivers, frozen vault that keeps 2 billion people alive, is being ripped apart by militarization, hydropower mega projects, aggressive mining, and mass forced relocations that Beijing sells as development. But behind the gleaming dams, the highways, the border villages, and the railway lines lies a growing ecological catastrophe that threatens not just Tibet's fragile mountains, but Asia's entire water future. As China flaunted its renewable credentials on the COP30 stage, experts demanded the truth. Can the world ignore the ecological meltdown unfolding in Tibet any longer? Hello and welcome. You're watching Statecraft with me, Geeta Mohan. For years, the world saw Tibet's infrastructure boom only through the narrow lens of geopolitics. Border tensions with India, military build-ups, and dual-use highways carving through mountains. But the real story, the one that erupted at the COP30 Global Climate Summit, lies in the environmental wreckage beneath these projects. Hydropower dams that destabilize fault lines, mining operations that poison rivers, permafrost melt that undermines entire landscapes, and forced relocations that erase centuries of indigenous ecological knowledge. All of it collides into one devastating crisis. As Tibet warms nearly 3 times faster than the global average, could COP30 afford to pretend this was just an internal Chinese issue? Tibet's ecological meltdown is no longer a distant crisis tucked away in the Himalayas. It was one of the central flashpoints at COP30 held in Brazil, where China's narrative of environmental leadership collided head-on with a mountain of evidence documenting degradation, displacement, and ecological collapse across the plateau. For decades, Chinese infrastructure in Tibet was framed as a geopolitical chessboard, an extension of Beijing's rivalry with India, or a demonstration of state power at high altitude.
Tibet as the third pole. So there are different names given to Tibet. So this clearly shows the global importance of the Tibetan plateau. As of now, the Tibetan plateau is facing a grave environmental situation. So the first, I want to stress about the glaciers melting. So due to the climate change and with the failed Chinese government policies, the glaciers in Tibet is melting twice the rate as that of the rest of the world, right? With all this, climate change and the failed policies, this also led to the grassland desertification, all this permafrost are melting. So these are due to the climatic condition general people are facing. So secondly, I want to focus on the damming issues. There are many Tibetan rivers which are transboundary rivers, and it flows from Tibet to different countries. So there were around 1.5 billion people who are directly or indirectly dependent on the Tibetan rivers. So all these major rivers are dammed by Chinese governments. So these have impact not only to the Tibetan, but has impact also to the downstream countries. And the third one is a natural disaster. So since 2016, there are consecutive, natural disaster happening inside Tibet. And there were floods, droughts, landslides, earthquakes. So there are many natural disasters happening inside Tibet. So these are the, 3 main issues that Tibetan plateau is facing now.
But Stockholm-based Institute for Security and Development Policy, that is ISDP, tore that curtain apart. Its new report declares unequivocally that Tibet has reached ecological breakdown and that this breakdown now threatens Asia's water security, regional stability, and the very integrity of global climate governance. China, meanwhile, continued to parade itself as a champion of green progress, pointing to its massive renewable investments and prominent presence at climate summits. But in Tibet, the so-called third pole, hydropower, mining, militarization, and mass displacement have converged into a slow and steady ecological implosion. At COP30, this contradiction was finally dragged into the spotlight. Militarization is not a footnote in Tibet. It is the spine of China's development strategy. Since the 2020 border standoff with India, Beijing has accelerated both military and dual-use infrastructure, expanding highways, railways, helipads, and border villages at a scale that is staggering even by Chinese standards. These projects are advertised as tools of modernization, but on the ground, they bulldoze through fragile ecosystems, displace nomadic populations, and enable rapid mobilization of troops and equipment along one of the world's most dense frontiers. And when militarization meets hydropower ambitions, Tibet becomes a ticking geological time bomb.
For a healthy flow of Asian rivers, protection of Tibet Plateau is absolutely necessary. Unfortunately, ever since China's occupation of Tibet in the 1950s, the culture in Tibet, the kind of culture we had in Tibet, the culture of respecting nature, the culture of protecting lakes, rivers, mountains, forests, wild animals, and glaciers has been undermined by a colonial culture that has been imposed in Tibet. And the colonial rule that wants to take up everything possibly available in the occupied land for the development of China. So in this process, China built hundreds of dams, and China is building and planning to build one of the biggest dams on earth, and which means the flow of the Asian rivers would be disturbed. And also increasing number of mining across Tibet has resulted in release of mine waste into those rivers and pollution of those rivers. There has been instances. And there's another case, Tibetan river called Nyakchu, which is one of the biggest tributary of Yangtze River, the longest river in Asia, was polluted by release of lithium mine waste, and which resulted in mass death of fish. And people were not able to drink from those rivers. So someone like me who used to drink directly from those rivers, when I go back to Tibet, the situation will not be the same. I won't feel safe to go lie down on a river that flows around my village to drink, because things have changed. Things have changed because China's occupation, because of a colonial rule and colonial policy that has imposed destruction of Tibetan Plateau. But of course, Tibetan people, China's government, international community can and should work together for the protection of Tibetan Plateau, because it is need for all.
ISDP's report highlights one of Beijing's most audacious ventures, the Midog Mega Dam on the Yarlung Tsangpo, known downstream or in India as the Brahmaputra, at an estimated cost exceeding $160 billion. Celebrated inside China as an engineering marvel, this dam sits at the intersection of two volatile tectonic suture zones, the Tsangpo Suture and the Eurasian Indian Suture. This region has a violent geological history of powerful earthquakes and landslides. Yet Beijing is doubling down on massive infrastructure in this already unstable terrain. The stakes are not just geological. Downstream countries like India and Bangladesh depend heavily on the Brahmaputra's flow, and China's refusal to share transparent hydrological data, environmental assessments, or disaster response plans amplifies the risk dramatically. Every cubic meter of water trapped or diverted upstream has potential repercussions for millions downstream, a reality China prefers to downplay while promoting the dam as a symbol of national achievement.
It is the only pole, therefore, that is surrounded by half the world's population on its doorstep. That is why it's actually, in a sense, more vital than the other poles, because of its immediate impact on the populations and human communities, industry and agriculture of China, India, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Pakistan, all of those surrounding countries. Okay, so this is a really, really important part, because it plays a crucial component in what is called water cycles. Asia's water cycles center on the third pole region. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, that water cycle creates the Tibetan Plateau and the Third Pole region as a source of Asia's major rivers. The Indus, the Brahmaputra, the Ganges, the Sutlej, the Irrawaddy, the Mekong, the Tarim to the north, the Yangtze, the Yellow, all of these rivers, which supply and act as the basis of almost all human civilization in Asia, come from the Third Pole region. Okay, that's why they call it the water tower of Asia.
The landscape itself is speaking louder than Beijing's rhetoric. Just last week, the Hongqi Bridge on the Sichuan-Tibet highway collapsed after a landslide, a chilling reminder that infrastructure built on melting permafrost and unstable mountainsides is inherently vulnerable. Videos circulating on Chinese social media show concrete slabs sliding into the valley below, a stark visual of what happens when giant engineering projects collide with a high-altitude environment in turmoil. The ecological consequences extend far beyond single events. According to the Stockholm paper, roughly 75% of the Tibetan plateau is now classified as moderately to severe ecologically vulnerable. Permafrost, which covers 40% of the region and forms the structural backbone of Tibet's mountains, is thawing at unprecedented rates. As permafrost melts, mountains weaken, slopes collapse, and the very foundations of infrastructure start to fail. Roads buckle, railways warp, and bridges crack like brittle bones. This is not an academic concern. Nearly 2 billion people across South and Southeast Asia depend on rivers originating in Tibet. If the plateau crumbles, Asia's water future cracks with it. But while hydropower and militarization attract much of the attention, the mining boom in Tibet is equally destructive. China's hunger for critical raw materials, lithium, copper, rare earths, gold, is being fed by aggressive extraction across the plateau. These operations are rife with environmental abuses, toxic waste discharge, and the near total exclusion of Tibetan communities from decision-making. The People's Armed Police frequently secures these sites, reflecting the deep entanglement of economic and security agendas. For Tibetans, mining is not just an economic activity, it is a force of cultural erasure and ecological devastation. Protests have surged since 2009, with nomads, herders, and villagers challenging pollution, poisoned rivers, dead livestock, and devastated grasslands. But Beijing's response has been swift: arrests, crackdowns, and expanded surveillance, turning mining zones into militarized pockets where dissent is suffocated before it can be heard. Forced displacement is another cornerstone of this ecological meltdown. Between 2000 and 2025, nearly 930,000 Tibetans have been relocated, stripped from ancestral lands where they maintained ecological balance for centuries. These relocations are often framed as poverty alleviation or environmental protection, but in reality, they enable mining, dam construction, and infrastructure expansion. Entire nomadic communities, the traditional stewards of Tibet's high-altitude grasslands, are pushed into concrete settlements that fracture their cultural identity and sever their relationship with their land.
The Chinese government has launched this massive campaign of rehousing and relocation of Tibetans across the Tibetan plateau. Over 2 million Tibetans over the past 6 years have been forced to leave their traditional villages and move into new ones in the name of building what the government calls a new socialist countryside. Tibetans have no say in these policies that are radically affecting their traditional way of life. The analysis of the satellite imagery that has been collected by Human Rights Watch shows entire villages where Tibetans have lived for generations have been demolished and razed down to the ground. This is not solely a campaign that builds new houses for people. This is also a campaign that destroys traditional villages. As the campaign progresses, then you can see the new socialist villages appearing, basically rows of identical houses, irrespective of the location, irrespective of the altitude, irrespective of whether people are farmers or herders. By remodeling the way that Tibetan villages are organized, the Chinese government is clearly pursuing a strategy of increased control. Traditionally, Tibetan nomads have been moving several times a year with their herds across the grasslands. They've done that for generations. The new policy is actually to force them to abandon their nomadic ways and become sedentary populations.
This forced relocation extends beyond hydropower zones. Since 2000 alone, at least 144,468 Tibetans have been displaced specifically because of dam projects. More relocations are planned as Beijing accelerates its hydropower superbase ambitions. The consequences of such demographic engineering are immense. Nomadic herders who preserved ecological balance for millennia are being replaced by concrete, surveillance, and state-monitored, well-off villages built along sensitive border regions. In these spaces, Tibetan knowledge systems are erased while Beijing's administrative and military apparatus tightens its grip. Historically, resource extraction in Tibet is not new. When the People's Republic of China assumed full control in the 1950s, it unleashed decades of state-run logging and mining across the plateau. Forests, once stretching across 25.2 million hectares, were slashed down to 13.57 million hectares by 1985. This rampant extraction contributed to catastrophic flooding, including the devastating 1998 Yangtze flood that jolted Beijing into temporarily restricting large-scale logging. But despite new regulations, illegal and unsustainable practices persisted, continuing the cycle of erosion, landslides, and ecological instability. Mining also followed a familiar pattern: profit-driven extraction with little regard for environmental or community welfare. Toxic runoffs from lithium mining killed fish, poisoned rivers, and triggered protests across Tibetan prefectures. Yet, the push intensified, driven by global demand for CRMs and China's determination to dominate the supply chain. Infrastructure expansion went hand in hand with this extractive model. Roads, railways, pipelines, and border villages emerged as conduits not only for minerals but also for military logistics. By the 1990s, Tibet's road network was around 4,536 miles. Today, it has exploded to nearly 74,000 miles. The Qinghai-Tibet Railway, celebrated in China as an engineering triumph, also serves as a lifeline for troop movement, resource transport, and demographic transformation. The dual-use nature of border infrastructure is unmistakable. China's well-off villages near the Indian frontier double as civilian settlements and military staging points. These villages are symbols of Beijing's claim over borderlands, populated, surveilled, and infused with state presence, all while adding to ecological stress through construction, road building, and habitat disruption. Climate change magnifies every one of these impacts. Tibet's designation as the third pole is no poetic metaphor. It contains largest volume of frozen water outside the Arctic and Antarctic. As global temperatures rise, Tibet is warming nearly 3 times faster than the global average. Glaciers retreat, permafrost melts, weather patterns swing unpredictably, and watersheds feeding Asia's great rivers, the Brahmaputra, Mekong, Yangtze, Yellow, face destabilization. This is not just a Tibetan tragedy, it is an Asian crisis. Wildfires, droughts, flash floods, and collapsing grasslands destabilize livelihoods across the plateau. Downstream, 1/3 of the world's population becomes vulnerable as river flows fluctuate, water security erodes, and geopolitical tensions sharpen. Beyond the ecological devastation lies cultural dislocation. Tibetan nomads and pastoral communities who have lived in harmony with these high-altitude ecosystems for thousands of years are witnessing the rapid disintegration of their way of life. Forced relocations, surveillance, urbanization, and displacement to make way for dams and mines dismantle centuries-old knowledge systems essential for high-altitude ecological stewardship. China calls it modernization. Tibetans experience it as dispossession. And at COP30, these long-suppressed realities push through the cracks of China's carefully curated global image. ISDP delegation urged world leaders to confront China's contradictions, its green leadership claims versus its destructive practices in Tibet. They demanded transparency, data access, and independent oversight through UN-led hydrological, climate, and permafrost monitoring. They call for transboundary water governance mechanisms, including a Brahmaputra Basin Commission, to ensure coordinated data sharing and early warning systems. They pushed for carbon disclosure, hydropower impact assessments, mining oversight, rights-based cultural protection mechanisms, and annual reporting to the UN Human Rights Council on displacement patterns. Their message was clear: Tibet cannot remain invisible in the global climate agenda. The plateau's breakdown is not an isolated event, but a cascading crisis with implications across continents. As COP30 unfolded, activists amplified the same warning. Chinese hydropower expansion threatens regional water security. Mining devastates ecosystems and communities. Militarization reshapes borders and destabilizes landscapes. Forced relocations unravel cultural continuity, and permafrost melt threatens to swallow infrastructure whole. Key data underscores the urgency. Forest cover nearly halved between 1950 and 1985. Road networks multiplied to almost 74,000 miles. Over 144,468 Tibetans displaced by dams alone since 2000. Mining protests surged since 2009. Plateau warming has tripled the global average. Infrastructure as military as it is civilian. Every statistic is a symptom of a deeper crisis: the convergence of ecological collapse, state-driven engineering, and geopolitical strategy. The tragedy is colossal, the stakes are continental, and the silence is no longer acceptable. Tibet's ecological meltdown is the product of decades of extractive policy, militarized development, and forced demographic changes under Chinese rule. At COP30, experts and activists made one thing impossible to ignore: global climate governance, regional stability, and the lives of billions depend on what happens in Tibet. And the world watched as these warnings echoed through the conference halls in Belém. Thank you for watching Statecraft.